Hello, here's a Christmas ghost story from Norway. There was once an old lady who decided that she wanted to go to the early morning church service on Christmas Day. And she thought about this and decided that she could probably get through the service on 1 cup of coffee and then she'd have breakfast when she got back. So before she went to bed on Christmas Eve, she left the coffee making equipment with her servant, gave the girl strict instructions that she was to start making the coffee as soon as her mistress called. Well, the old lady went to bed, and at some point during the night she woke up. There was a bit of moonlight coming in through a crack in the curtains, and she didn't know what time it was, so she rolled over and looked at her clock, and it had stopped at 11:30. So she lay there for a few moments thinking and decided maybe if she got up and had a look out into the street, she might get an idea of what time of night it was. So she got up. She went and opened the curtains and she looked out into the street. It was bathed in moonlight. She couldn't see anyone around. And at that time of year, at that part of Norway, it's dark pretty much all of the day. So that wasn't much of a help. And then, to her horror, she realised that the church at the end of the street had every window blazing with light. And she thought, oh my goodness, I've overslept. The service has already started. So she called out to her servant to put the coffee on. She got herself washed and dressed. She swallowed the coffee, picked up her Bible, threw her cloak round her shoulders. Now, it was a very particular sort of cloak. It was a nice shade of pink, and it had a fur lining to it. And she went out to walk down the street to the church. Well, it was very quiet when she got out in the street. There was nobody around, but she thought to herself, well, anyone who's going to be at church is already going to be there, and anyone who's not going to church, well, they're going to be indoors getting ready for the Christmas feast. So she got to the church, and sure enough, the service had started. So she made herself as quietly as she could down to her usual pew at the front of the church, sat down, had a quick look round, and the church was full that night. But she didn't recognise anybody in the congregation. Well, no, that's not quite true. You see, scattered throughout the congregation, there were 1 or 2 people that she thought she did recognise, but she couldn't work out where she'd seen them before. A few moments later, the priest mounted the pulpit to begin his sermon, and again it wasn't the normal priest who preached at that church, but there was something about him that rang a bell in the back of her mind. He started to preach, and it was a very good sermon, and the old lady was really impressed at the way the congregation listened. Nobody coughed, nobody shuffled their feet, nobody sat riffling through a hymn book because they were bored. You could have heard a pin drop. She took another look round, and one thing did strike her. Everyone in the congregation did look very, very pale, but she just put that down to the trick of the gaslighting in the church. The priest finished his sermon. The organ started to play for a hymn, and just as the old lady was reaching forward to pick up her hymn book, the old lady sitting to her left looked at her and said, "Pick up your Bible. Don't bother to put your cloak on properly. Leave now. They're not happy." "I beg your pardon," asked the old lady. "This service is for the dead. They're not happy with having a living person in the church with them. If you are still here at the end of the service, they will tear you to pieces." And suddenly, the old lady, things started to make sense to her. She suddenly realised all those people that she thought she'd recognised. They were all friends and neighbours of her parents. The old lady sitting next to her had lived in the apartment next to hers when she'd first got married 50 odd years ago. The priest, he was the priest who preached at that church when she was a little girl. Well, she grabbed her Bible. She put the cloak round her shoulders, but she didn't bother to tie it up. She just grabbed it with her hand. She got out of her pew and she started to walk down the aisle. Now, as she did, she thought to herself, why do I always sit at the front? It felt as if she was wading through treacle. And as she walked down the aisle, she realised that all the heads were turning to look at her. Halfway down the aisle, she felt like her knees were going to give way. They felt like they turned to jelly, but she kept on going, and now hands were beginning to reach out to grab her. And as she got to the door of the church, something snagged on her cloak. She gave a shriek, she let go of the cloak, and she broke into a run down the steps of the church, down the street. She didn't stop running until she got to her front door. She fumbled with her key to get the door open, and as she opened the door and fell into the hall, she heard the clock in the parlour strike 1. Well, as you can imagine, she went back to bed and she didn't bother to get up in time to go to church in the morning. But the people who did go to church that day were greeted by a very strange sight, because there, lying outside the door of the church, was a very striking pink cloak with a fur lining, and it had been torn to shreds. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.